I never thought the thing that would break us would start with a chair and a clock. It seems ridiculous in a way, that a little room with soft light and a notepad could eat a person alive. But if you live through it, nothing about it feels ridiculous. It feels precise. It feels like watching your life get edited one quiet sentence at a time until the version of you that used to be whole is a footnote. My name is Alex. I was 38 when it all fell apart. We'd been married 7 years. Her name was Elena. We met at a friend's wedding, the kind of meeting that prompts stories later about how could we have known. Back then she was incandescent, 1,000 small enthusiasms folded into one person, the perfect mix of fierce and kind. She taught literature at a community college, graded papers with more care than some people give to friends. I worked in product design. We never had much money, but we had dinners that were more theatre than routine, and a tiny apartment with plants that thrived under her voice. 2 years into our marriage, we tried to have a child. We lost it at 12 weeks. There are things grief does to you that aren't narrated in books about mourning. They're quieter, and they rearrange the furniture of a marriage. Elena withdrew in a way that looked like careful retreat. More nights reading on the couch, long silences in the car after a grocery run, an absence that wasn't dramatic so much as insidious. She went to the doctor, then to a counselor, then to more sessions. She said the therapy helped. She smiled again in ways that felt like relief. I believed the narrative. Trauma, help, healing. I want to say I saw the first warning signs and did something. I didn't. I thought seeing her try to heal was all that mattered. I paid for the therapy. I sat in a waiting room once and leafed through a dusty magazine while she was inside, and I thought of it as necessary expense, like replacing the roof. Because love is practical sometimes, you pay for what keeps the house dry. At first, the therapist, Dr. Lewis, seemed like a good thing. Middle-aged, quiet, with a voice that didn't rush. He listened. That's a rare and underrated talent. She seemed to respond. She began to write again. She took a class on ekphrasis. Little lights came back on. That was the relief I wanted. The trouble began, as these things often do, in little ways that I told myself were nothing. She started quoting what he'd said at breakfasts. He told me it's okay to feel hollow sometimes, she'd say, stirring her coffee. He says grief has seasons. That sounded fine. Maybe even comforting. Therapists say things that become small talismans. You keep them like stones in your pocket. Then she began to fold his phrases into arguments with me. Dr. Lewis says we should not gaslight ourselves into pretending everything's fine. He suggested we set boundaries about work. I remember laughing the first time, a brittle sound. What, does he want to draft our grocery list too? She smiled and said, he's just helping me find my voice again. She started booking extra sessions, weeknight appointments, midday phone calls that she said were case notes. I thought, she's investing in getting better. I thought, good. I wanted her well more than anything. One evening, though, I don't remember the date precisely, only the small details like the way the rain hit the window and the yellow light of the street lamp. She said something that lodged in me like a seed. We were folding laundry and a song about small domestic things played on the radio. She set a t-shirt on the couch and said, casually, he said I deserve to feel wanted. It was the phrase, deserve to feel wanted, that cut me. It was a clinical-sounding entitlement and also a plea, and it landed like an accusation and a confession at the same time. I asked, stupidly, wanted by who? She folded towels, avoided my eyes. By someone who understands me, she said. She didn't say his name, and I didn't ask the right questions. There have been 100 moments since that morning where I've judged myself for not asking. But grief has a way of disguising itself as humility. You think the person you love is fragile and you don't want to pry. You confuse generosity with negligence. I didn't see the line being drawn because it was drawn with ink so fine I called it shadow. The first real alarm arrived in the form of a message on her laptop. I shouldn't have been on it. She'd left it unattended, and I opened an email because I needed to RSVP to a wedding and the browser was already warm with her tabs. The subject line was clinical. Session 12, follow-up notes. It was from a clinic address. I opened it and skimmed the text. It was professional. Medicalese for the most part. References to CBT, to attachment styles, to recommended readings. There were no fireworks. There was only a date and a time and an upcoming follow-up. But under the formal prose, there was a line that was not standard. A single sentence in his voice that read, unexpectedly intimate, "Your attention to metaphor shows a tenderness I haven't seen in years." It's absurd how much weight one line can carry. It looked like a misplaced compliment in a clinical template, but when you're paranoiac and tired, you see patterns where there are none. I closed the screen and told myself to be rational. He was a doctor. He'd likely been writing notes for other patients. I told myself another story, the practical tale of misclicks and administrative carelessness. Then the messages became a pattern. A late-night text I found when she left her phone on the kitchen counter. A short thread, professional tone at first, then a line that read, "You were brave today." That's not treatment objectivity, that's a phrase for a confidant. I didn't confront her at once. Maybe part of me didn't want to catch what I suspected. It's a strange human calculus. If you walk toward a fire, you risk burning. If you stay away, maybe the fire will die. So I watched small things. The way her hair smelled different sometimes, a cologne that was not mine, the way she prolonged phone calls and then left the room smiling away from me. There's a creeping, specific boredom that therapy can produce when it becomes a place of flirtation rather than treatment, an intimacy born of being the person someone unpacks their rawest parts to. Someone who listens well becomes, absurdly, a candidate for love. When I finally confronted her, it was not cinematic. There was no shattered plate or slammed door. There was a Wednesday, and I had made coffee, and I asked, "Do you feel something for him?" She looked at me as if I'd asked whether the sky was blue. I expected a furious denial or a roll of the eyes. Instead, she went oddly quiet and then said simply, "I don't know how to be alone with that feeling." We talked for hours. She told me about the sessions when she felt held, about the way he named things she hadn't been able to name herself, about the sense of being seen. She didn't start with sex, she started with attention. "He noticed how my hands fidget," she said. "He laughed at a joke I'd forgotten to tell anyone. He asked about the book I'd been too ashamed to tell you I loved." It sounded small. It sounded like the world should be generous to small attentions. I wanted to be generous in return, but then she said, "It's more than attention, Alex. He understands pain. He knows how to map it. He doesn't look at me like I'm breaking." That phrase, "he doesn't look at me like I'm breaking," was the most human knife. She'd felt broken and wanted to be treated as whole, and if a man with credentials could offer that, who am I to complain? Except I didn't want to be the container who allowed my wife to arrive at wholeness in someone else's arms. She admitted to a growing emotional dependence. The therapist had, she said, become a place where she could experiment with being loved in a way that felt less precarious. I remember feeling a cold fury, less at the therapist than at myself for not being the place she could experiment. 3 months later, I found messages that made the geometry of the situation undeniable. Affectionate, coy, sometimes as banal as "can't wait to see you tomorrow," and sometimes as raw as "I miss you at night." They were not frequent. They were also not one-off. There was a continuity that felt like a betrayal built in slow strokes. When I took those messages to her, she did not deny the content. She argued instead about language and agency, about the power imbalance in therapy and the way therapists are supposed to be neutral, how she had misinterpreted attention for intimacy. She said she had been lonely and he was a mirror in a way I had not been. "It started with curiosity," she said. "It wasn't like a sudden affair. It was a leaning." I remember thinking about ethics then, the oath to do no harm and the peculiar under-discussed reality that boundaries can be misread. I thought of the times she told me about a session and the way her voice would lighten. Those tiny shifts, accumulated, make a new country of a person. I went to the clinic. I made an appointment with the reception, a ridiculous theater of pretense. The woman at the front desk knew me. She had once handed me a brochure while I sat in the waiting room with Eleanor. I sat in the same chair and watched the same flowers on the wall. I told myself I would be calm. I told myself I would demand professional accountability. The therapist was not dramatic. He was a man his 50s, with thin hair and the same steady voice that had reassured my wife. He maintained his composure, answered questions with a clinical neutrality that made my skin crawl. He denied misconduct. He offered a protocol of supervision notes and documentation. He spoke of transference, of patients projecting desire onto caregivers. He used words that contained gravity but not guilt. What I wanted were confessions. What I wanted was to see him flinch. Instead, I saw professional defense. "We run a tight practice," he said. "We keep records. We follow guidelines." He was not arrogant. He was careful. He was trained. And training is a kind of armor. After that meeting, I came home and packed a bag. We spoke again, softer now, because the theatrical anger had been used up in the clinic room where words had been arranged like armor. She said she had fallen in love with somebody she thought could help her. She said she wanted to end the marriage, that staying felt like suffocating under a kindness only half offered. There was no accusation. There was only an exhausted sorrow like ripples in rain. People imagine infidelity as a single type of betrayal, bodies in beds and shameful photos and dramatic exposés. This wasn't that. It was a slow seizure of intimacy by a different category of human need, the need to be seen and not fixed. It was a deception built on the plausible excuse of healing. It was, in some ways, more devious because it felt therapeutic and therefore trustworthy. There were practical things to do. There are always practical things. We cancelled every scheduled event for a week and then a month. Friends rearranged their houses around us. Some offered sanctuary, a couch to sleep on, a fishing day, silence. Others disappeared in that particular way people do when they don't want to pick a side. My parents were quiet. They liked to think of us as a stable project and not a disaster. My sister called more often, our conversations full of clumsy questions. "Do you want me to come over? Do you want me to pick up groceries?" Love is often practical after breakdown. We separated. Not by a blow-up fight, but by a mutual exhausted decision. She would move out for a while and test the life she thought she wanted. She cried. I did too, but not with the gushing spectacle of movies. Our tears were administrative, small, efficient, ritual. We sorted what would go to whose apartment. We divided books and photographs with an awkward choreography. In the months that followed, the world became a series of appointments. Lawyers, therapists, support groups for partners of the betrayed. Yes, those exist, nights of swallowing meals without appetite. I learned how to make coffee for one. I learned the humiliation of explaining to colleagues why I needed 3 days off. I learned that grief, unchecked, is a disease of daily life. People online ask, was I angry? Yes. I was furious at the therapist for professional failing and at Elena for choosing to re-inhabit herself elsewhere. I was furious at myself for thinking love is durable against the quiet pressures of absence. But fury was not a map. Fury told me where I felt hurt, but it did not show the ground to walk on. I learned to use other tools. Therapy, because why not? Friends who would call at 2 a.m. and not demand answers. Exercise. Small things that had been luxuries became anchors. We had a final conversation in the autumn sun, sitting on a bench near the river where we used to date. She held my hand like someone holding a book she was returning. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said. I wanted to find myself. I could see the person she described, someone leveling herself slowly into light and leaving the rest behind. I said then what I had rehearsed only in private before. Finding yourself shouldn't require someone else to break your life. She looked at me with tired, clear eyes, and I recognized that part of her was both liberated and miserably demolished. Divorce proceeded in the quiet, as things do when there are no dramatic acts left to perform. We divided what was necessary. We agreed not to litigate. We spoke about mutual friends and tried to give them space to choose without coercion. The therapist's name faded from the center of our argument as the legal and logistical landscape asserted itself. Healing is fulsome and cunning. Not long after the split, a woman from a support group told me a sentence that nagged and then nourished. Sometimes people choose a mirror when they don't know how to be held. That phrase did not absolve anyone, but it localized the grief. People choose mirrors because they want to see themselves back whole. Therapists are, for many, the first safe mirror after trauma. But if the mirror becomes a window too often, it leads to temptation. Months later, I sat in a therapist's office of my own. I had tried to deny that the tactic that healed Elena might have been a healing for me too. Small attention, daily presence, someone who gave me language for my hurt. I learned to stop framing myself only as a betrayed spouse and start seeing myself as a man with needs and a life to rebuild. I learned the merciful smallness of chores as ritual, cooking, returning library books, fixing the drip in the kitchen sink. These are ordinary acts. They become religion when you're trying not to implode. I started to date after a long while. The first date was clumsy, polite, and full of the awkwardness of someone who had both suffered and learned. I told her briefly that I had been married and that things ended. She asked a few tender questions and then told me about a mountain she wanted to hike. I found the conversation restorative, not because it was profound, but because it was mundane. It felt like slow excavation, scraping away debris until something palpable remained. Sometimes, weeks or months later, I would pass a clinic and my chest would tighten. Some parts of a story are permanent triggers. I could not help but imagine him, in his chair, saying the wrong thing. But the tightness passed faster each time. Grief has a way of dulling edges even as it leaves its shape behind. I do not pretend my experience is universal. Not everyone is betrayed by a therapist. Not every therapist is a wolf in patient clothing. Most are professionals trying to help. But I learned something essential about intimacy, power, and the ethics of attention. When we outsource our care to a person with authority, we risk reassigning our loyalties. If you are reading this because you suspect something similar, please take practical steps. Document what you find, get counsel, and above all, protect your well-being. If you are the partner who is seeking healing, understand the power dynamics at play. If you are a therapist reading this, remember the weight of your gaze. Boundaries are not just rules, they are the scaffolding of trust. The last time Eleanor and I spoke about the therapist, we both had stopped shouting at the weather of our lives. We were quieter, sober. "I am sorry," she said, and I said, "So am I," for the ways I was absent. We were able to say small kindnesses then, without the wish to use them as absolution. You can never go back to the exact book you were before. You get printed with new margins. My life isn't the same. It is, if anything, more deliberate. I notice the details, my friend's laughter, the way my neighbor plants marigolds, the creak of the back door that I now oil every month. Those small acts are the antithesis of the clinical seduction that once stole my life, a reminder that attention, when offered without pretense, is the real work of love. If you came to this for drama, I can only offer the bluntness of truth. Betrayal can be soft as a hand on your shoulder and still rip you open. It's often the kind that hides inside prescriptions and recommendations and the patient's need to be understood. But it ends as all human things do, messy, unresolved sometimes, and then, if you are lucky, reclaimed. Sometimes the worst kind of betrayal isn't when someone lies to you, it's when they let someone else replace you in their heart. I spent months trying to understand what went wrong, wondering if I could have done anything differently. But in the end, I realized that some losses aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to teach you who you really are. If this story hit close to home or made you feel something, don't forget to give it a like. It really helps more people find these stories. And if you'd like to hear more real confessions, more true stories about love, betrayal, and everything in between, make sure to subscribe. I've got plenty more to share.